Welcome to Insider, where we break down the biggest stories shaping Israel, the region, and the world. I'm Maayan Hoffman, Executive Editor at ILTV, and I'll be your host. Tonight, we turn our attention to Donald Trump's latest ultimatum, a bold warning that if Israeli hostages are not freed by Saturday, hell breaks loose. What does that actually mean? And will it have any impact? We'll also examine Trump's Gaza plan, one that has stirred controversy, drawn pushback from key regional players, and raised questions about the future of U.S. involvement, with Saudi Arabia rejecting it outright, and Trump hinting at cutting aid to Jordan and Egypt. Could this approach shake up diplomacy or further complicate an already volatile situation? Plus, while most Western leaders have remained measured, Trump is once again taking an aggressive stance in support of Israel. Why is he the only one speaking out this way? And what are the risks of his rhetoric? To help answer these questions and more, we have Rabbi Pessach Wolicki, Executive Director of Israel365 Action, and Dan Perry, former Chief Editor of the Associated Press in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. Let's get into it. Thanks for being here. All right, so Trump has issued yet another ultimatum. Last night, we heard if the hostages do not come out by Saturday, of course, this was in response to Hamas saying they are going to stop releasing hostages, and the terrible state of the 3 hostages that were released on Saturday, emaciated, sick. Many compared it to Nazi Germany. So, what exactly does he mean, Dan? What is hell going to look like, and how do you think that's going to play out?
Well, in theory, he could authorize Israel to resume the war with even more brutality than before. And I suppose in some version of the universe that might terrify Hamas. But not in my version of the universe, because these are nihilist jihadis who thrive off the destruction of their own territory and the suffering of their own people because of the weird state of the Palestinian national psychosis, I have to say, at this moment in history. I think Trump's greater leverage might be on the Arab states that, to various degrees, support, enable, acquiesce to, maybe even are fearful of taking on Hamas. And that could include, indeed, the entire so-called array of moderate Sunni states, from Jordan, Egypt, to others like Saudi Arabia, and also quite potentially Qatar. It's a delicate dance vis-a-vis Qatar because the U.S. has a very important military base there. It's biggest in the region. It's not clear who has leverage on whom in this situation. But Qatar does like to make nice with the world. They like to pretend they're a normative country, and that doesn't really go hand in hand with supporting an Iranian-backed terrorist group. So I think there may be some leverage to apply in the Arab countries.
Now, do you feel, Pessach, that ultimately that the hell to pay will be specifically on Gaza, on Hamas, and and that this will then make Hamas, make Qatar and the Arabs, as you're saying, push the hostages, let them come out of Gaza? I mean, I've heard some rumors that hell to pay might be a threat toward Iran or towards one of the regional players.
Well, this speculation and this not knowing what Trump could mean, I think, is part of his playbook. When Donald Trump ran for president back in 2016 already, one of his big criticisms against the foreign policy establishment was that the Western foreign policy always telegraphs what it's going to do. And the bad actors tend to be much more cagey about it. And he really felt that, why should we be always saying what we're going to do? So I think that this whole conversation, this whole speculation, the whole doubt is really part of what Donald Trump's game plan is. And if I could just comment on how refreshing it is to hear a president of the United States actually play the Middle East negotiating game better than pretty much any Western leader. It's one of the great ironies of Donald Trump that he entered office in 2016 with zero foreign policy experience, and he seems to be the best at handling the Middle East. And what I mean by that is that the way things have always gone with Israel and our enemies is that the Arabs stake out a position, usually quite an extreme position, and then stick to it and never budge. And they just wait it out and stick to their position. And eventually, the Israelis move the goalposts closer to them. And here, what Donald Trump is doing, when Hamas says, we're no longer releasing any more hostages, we're breaking the deal. So they're basically moving the goalposts in their direction. He moves the goalposts in the opposite direction and plays the same game as them, saying, not only did you have to, he didn't say you have to continue with the deal. He said you now need to release everybody.
Right.
So it's a negotiating ploy that I think is the right way to play it.
No, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I mean, 2 things to say. First of all, Generally speaking, of course, the Arabs do that, and the American and Western negotiating tactics have been rather simple-minded by comparison. But to be fair, the Arab League in 1968, 67, 68 started out with the three no's of never recognizing Israel, never negotiating with Israel, never having peace with Israel. I would say they moved. When Egypt made peace with Israel, it broke with the entire Arab League and they were kicked out. There has been certainly movement. The Palestinian national movement, such as it is, let's say Fatah and the PLO, used to stake out that very extreme position, namely a one-state solution that's basically a Palestinian state. They at least have moved away from that to positions I myself think they've stuck to too rigidly during the subsequent negotiations, but there has definitely been movement. But I want to agree with what Pessach says about the refreshing aspects of Trump's brinksmanship. And although, of course, much of it is speculation, we've sort of learned to understand Donald Trump, the mind of Trump a little bit. He loves to be a disruptor. He loves to break away with past dogmas and past procedures. And he certainly loves to expose the inadequacies of his predecessors. The Biden administration and Democratic administrations throughout the decades have projected great weakness vis-a-vis the Arabs and have more or less aided and abetted these extremist narratives that Pessach rightly bemoans. And Trump will have none of that. None of that. So, for example, I've been watching in the past year or more as the U.S. and the U.K. and other Western powers have allowed the Houthis to disrupt a third of global container traffic. It's madness. And have done very, very little to really push back forcefully. I would expect that Trump recognizes there's money on the table right there and would move against the Houthis if they ever try this again in subsequent months. Let's say the war resumes.
So, I mean, what kind of, why do you think it is, let's start with this, that Trump is the only Western leader that is able to do this? I mean, I feel like the hostage situation, which is going on now for 16 months, has really not been really raised enough by the Western leaders all around the world. Biden, in many ways, but also many other Western leaders. And Trump comes in, he sees these three hostages exit, and exactly as you said, he's mad. So why do you think it is like that?
The Israel-Palestine catastrophe is very much, at this point, in a war of narratives. And the narratives don't necessarily always support the Israeli mindset and the Israeli point of view that most people have in this country. What started off as an invasion, an unprovoked invasion, and a massacre of over 1,000 people by Hamas has become a global humanitarian cataclysm in Gaza. Now, I don't really know if 45,000 people were killed and how many were terrorists.
Right, that's Hamas numbers, and nobody really knows. But let's just call it that.
A great degree of destruction was visited on
100%.
Gaza.
They say no matter what, 80% of the infrastructure.
So monumental that it's taken over the visuals and it's taken over the narrative. And the question of who started what and who killed who and who said what to whom, you have to be a very dedicated student of this conflict to care anymore.
Hostages. I mean, yeah, I guess that's true. I mean, let's take Trump's plan for a minute.
I mean, I think...
Because before you respond, I'd rather, just because I want to be able to move on, I actually think that we need to talk a little bit about Trump's plan. So Trump has given this ultimatum: we will or will not get these hostages out on Saturday. But either way, we are eventually going to have this day after. Trump has offered for the U.S. to buy, essentially, or to take over Gaza. And he's really pushing to see that happen, despite the Arab nations going against it. I mean, what do you see? Is this possible? Is this real?
Well,
is it good?
well, Trump's plan really had, even in the way it was presented to us in the world, it really had two stages or two parts to it. First, a week before Netanyahu went, or more than a week before, he had announced this idea of relocating the Gazans to Egypt and Jordan. And then he dropped the bomb on us at the press conference saying that the United States would buy the Gaza Strip. Now, and one of the big questions people raise about this whole thing is feasibility. How does this actually work? And I think there again, and this goes back to what I was saying about Trump somehow understanding the negotiating in the Middle East better than all the career diplomats. And we saw that in his first term as well with the way he handled the Arab nations. I think what Trump does here is he moves the Overton window. He changes the conversation so drastically that now there are suddenly all kinds of options that we can talk about that we couldn't talk about before because of what he presented.
But is it something that you think we should do? Like, should we move the Gazans out of Gaza?
That part, absolutely. And I
Dan?
Can I make the case?
Yes, I'm going to get back, but Dan, do you think we should?
From the beginning of Zionism, there was a mutual fantasy. The Jews and the Arabs didn't want the others to be here, and if they could somehow vanish, I think a lot of people on either side somehow, in their heart of hearts, wouldn't be so upset.
Okay, so now
should Israel involve itself in engineering an exodus of over 2 million people who are historically fanatically attached to their land, guaranteeing that we'll have 2 generations from now another 5 million so-called refugees, half of them wanting to return to not Gaza but to Israel, and a great many of them becoming terrorists, we'd be creating a whole new problem. And just to be clear, I don't think the Gazans should be jailed in Gaza. Just like any of us have the right to pick up and go to France, if they wanted to, they should be allowed out. And one of Israel's major mistakes over the years was preventing it. I mean, I was involved personally in trying to help all these Gazans who were colleagues and friends of mine leave Gaza, and Israel wouldn't allow it. They wouldn't let them out.
That's
Madness.
crazy.
But on the other hand, even if Trump says it'll be voluntary, it's pretty clear to see how that could be perceived as a trick to create ethnic cleansing. I don't recommend that at this point in time, Israel blunder into that kind of historical mistake.
But you do. So now tell us why.
Well, let's start with the pushback against it has been that it's unjust and that it's immoral and that it's illegal. We had Olaf Scholz a couple days ago saying that it's illegal, that it's not consistent with international law. In 1947, when the UN proposed the partition plan, Israel accepted it. The Arab countries rejected it and declared war. Had the Arab countries accepted that original 2-state solution, there would have been a Palestinian Arab state side by side with a Jewish state, and not a single Arab citizen would have been displaced from their homes. It was the Arab armies, the largest armies were the Jordanian and the Egyptian. Without them, that war wouldn't have happened, who attacked the new Jewish state. And that war is what caused this refugee problem. It's what caused the mass population move into the Gaza Strip. And then the Egyptians had the Gaza Strip for 19 years. From 1948 to 1967, they had the Gaza Strip. They did not allow the resettlement of any Gazans who wanted to go to mainland Egypt. They didn't accept the UN funds that were put up at the time to help build homes and jobs for them. They didn't let them leave. And the Jordanians didn't allow Gazans to come into Judea and Samaria, to come into what's called the West Bank. That was a real open air prison if there ever was one. So this plan, historically, in terms of historical justice, but also in terms of international law, Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which then was expanded upon in the Geneva Conventions in the early 50s, grants a fundamental human right to emigrate to a neighboring country in time of war. And the Egyptians have been actively preventing, they've been withholding that basic human right from the civilians in Gaza ever since the war started.
So this is actually giving them their rights back.
From a standpoint of international law, and here to me is the bigger point of this whole thing. It is speculation about what will happen down in the future if now we have a bunch of new jihadists in neighboring countries. And that's a strategic question where frankly, I think that Israel does a much better job dealing with enemies on the other side of our borders in neighboring countries than we do in dealing with the Palestinians. And if that's the trade, I'll take it. But I think the larger point here is that finally we have Donald Trump, who is pointing the finger of responsibility for this whole problem in the direction that it belongs in. Those who are responsible for that entire population of refugees in Gaza and in Judea and Samaria are the Arab nations who rejected Israel over and over again. They start wars, they lose them, and they never have to take responsibility. It's Israel's problem to solve. And finally, someone's looking at Jordan and Egypt and saying, hey, you guys have to have a share in solving this problem. And I'll add that we discovered when we went into Rafah, we kind of knew it already, but we now had the evidence that it was Egypt who actively facilitated, not passively, actively facilitated all of the weaponry, all of the armaments, all of the supplies coming into Gaza. They helped create the problem that now needs to be solved. They should be taking responsibility.
Let Dan respond.
There is corruption in Egypt, and they were incompetent in policing the border, but it wasn't the policy of the government of Egypt.
It was Sisi's son who ran the border.
It wasn't the policy of Egypt to radicalize and to arm Hamas in Gaza. Egypt, a little bit like Israel, wishes this whole thing went away. Now, look, I lived in Egypt for 7 years. If there's one thing that I found there to be a consensus about, it's that they don't want the Palestinian problem to be their problem. Right? Good, bad, or indifferent, that's a fact. They're not going to accept.
They created it.
They didn't create it. They're not going to accept 2 million Gazans, or even hundreds of thousands of Gazans, into sparsely populated northern Sinai, where they already have a jihadi problem. So you can try to produce history lessons that put the onus on them somehow. It'll be maybe partly successful. You convince a few people. Practically speaking, they're not going to do it.
So what's
As for
gonna happen
Jordan,
to-
Jordan
go
already
ahead.
has 60 to 70% Palestinians.
Right.
The ruling Hashemites consider this a problem. The idea of compelling Jordan to receive them in huge numbers, again, is rather fantastical. Now, I suspect that Trump isn't serious because, frankly, and I'm sorry to say this, it's too stupid. It's not going to happen, okay? But as a negotiating ploy, sure. I think if he opened up the gates and allowed the Palestinians, let's say, to leave Gaza for, I don't know what, Indonesia, Malaysia.
I think Albania was on the
an idea.
table.
Yeah, maybe the West Bank. That might be a sort of elegant solution because then they're not leaving Palestine. If you did that out of 2.2 million, wouldn't surprise me at all to see 500,000 leave. Trump will take that as a win, and he'll declare that only he could have done it because to somehow diminish the problem of the
But to
overpopulation
move
of Gaza,
500,000
it'd be seen as a good thing.
Palestinians from Gaza to the West Bank puts Israel at much more risk. I mean, the West Bank is obviously much closer even to the center of the country than Gaza, which, is very dangerous down south. We saw what happened on October 7th, but it's extremely dangerous. I mean, these are radicalized Hamas terrorists in many cases.
Yeah,
some
but
are civilians, but some are
If they
not.
move to the West Bank now, then they would be sort of under the control of the PA and of Israel. You can mock the PA all you want. It's a better situation than having Hamas mobilize an entire, very tightly packed population into essentially a terrorist army. Israel has no particularly good options here. I fear that in the Middle East, the most that you can generally hope for is the least bad option. And humanity isn't particularly well wired to embrace an option that's bad, just the least bad. But for sure, I would bet that the idea that the vast majority of Gazans are going to voluntarily leave, and then the U.S. would take it over, own it, buy it, and build resorts there is absurd.
Well, and I also understand, just from a practical standpoint, it's not possible.
Not just is it implausible and impractical and would raise every conceivable political opposition from the region and from much of the world, but more to the point, it is a monumental distraction from the real task at hand, which is A, to get back the hostages, and B, to figure out how to remove Hamas from power in Gaza. That is a critical goal.
I want to stop because I want to give you a chance to respond. I'm stopping. I want you to respond.
There's a bigger problem here, which Donald Trump is the first leader to actually address, which is that with all of these, moving them to the West Bank or just getting Hamas out of power and leaving them all there, this just perpetuates the problem. We're going to have more and more and more. We're going to have more intifadas, and we're going to have more education about how Israel stole your land and the Palestinians.
Yeah, but I have to say something. Because the reality is that when Syrians fled from Syria with the war, and they fled to Western countries. And we've seen extreme terrorism and extremism move into those countries. Wherever the Gazans move, they're going to bring, if they're extremists, they're going to bring that ideology. So I don't know how just moving the problem along is actually to another country actually gets rid of the problem.
Well, has there been conflict where they've been trying to destroy the countries that they're in, where they're trying to...
in some cases, I would say there's been protests in the streets, there's been terrorism, there's been...
Everywhere the Palestinians go, they cause problems. 300,000 of them were deported from Kuwait a few years ago because the Kuwaitis couldn't handle the problem there. So no one wants them anywhere because when you have a population that has a genocidal ideology, of course no one wants them. The only way to defeat a genocidal ideology, we learned this from Imperial Japan and from Nazi Germany, the only reason that those ideologies kind of went away, were defeated, and those countries became rather benign, peaceful nations, is that they experienced unequivocal, undeniable defeat. And that's something that the Western world has forgotten about. Since World War II, there hasn't been a single war that's ended with a victor over
so we're going to run out of time, and I want everybody to have 30 seconds, 45 seconds to be able to give a final thought. Okay, so Trump's plan, it's impractical, it's unjust, it's not feasible. You're saying we should do it, but it's really not anyway the best solution. So what should we do? 30 seconds, what is your vision then for ending this conflict and getting these hostages home?
Well, getting the hostages home does, by the current deal on the table, mean ending the war and leaving Hamas in power there. But what should happen thereafter is that the U.S. should use all this Trumpian energy to put the squeeze massively on the entire Arab world to demand that Hamas move aside, be disarmed, perhaps exile in some places for its leadership, and be replaced, no matter the howls that this will inspire, by a revamped version of the Palestinian Authority, which would itself then come under pressure, not only to end the pay for slave programs that they just
which
did,
they claim they do,
under again, Trumpian pressure,
right.
But also to revise the educational system, which weirdly is not a Hamas system, but a PA system with the textbooks that call for genocidal action against the Jews.
Right,
the Arabs have to come under crushing pressure to change their entire paradigm, and that, Pesach, would be a version of the defeat that you rightly say.
And Pesach, you have 30 seconds to respond to Dan.
Well, the Palestinian Authority cannot be a part of this. There is no difference ideologically, only tactically, between the Palestinian Authority, Hamas, Islamic Jihad. They're all the same. And I believe that what we should do is push Trump's plan as far as it can go in terms of voluntary departure from the area. Whatever percentage of them leave. And then, I hate to say it, but the only way that we can really de-radicalize this population is by Israeli military authority taking over the Gaza Strip and bringing in the Emiratis, the other Abraham Accords nations, and they start to govern the civil life and the education there. And it may take decades to de-radicalize the population, but otherwise, it's only jihad.
One quick.
Okay, no, I'm sorry. We unfortunately are all out of time this evening, so you're not going to be able to respond. But I really do thank you, and thank you for being here this evening. For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at iltv.tv. Thanks for watching Insider. Have a safe and pleasant evening.